Every day we hear stories of the environmental pressures on our planet. The cutting of forests, the unsustainable extraction of resources, ever-increasing energy usage, the emerging realities of climate change. It is one of the great challenges of our urban age, and really it is the challenge of our urban age.
Clearly, we need solutions. And as Philip Enquist just pointed out to us, those solutions must come from the place where that is going to have the greatest impact on the future of the Great Lakes, and that's from cities.
David, our next panel represents some of the leading thinkers and doers in the area of building sustainable cities. Please welcome Gerald Butts, the President and CEO of World Wildlife Foundation of Canada. Jerry was the Principal Secretary to the Premier of Ontario and was involved in sweeping policies to protect Ontario's boreal forest. John Campbell, the CEO of Waterfront Ontario. He is overseeing a vision to redevelop Toronto Waterfront with a focus on the digital and design technologies that will make the Toronto Waterfront a leading example of sustainable building and living. And I would say that John's touch was what we talked about this morning in terms of that creative, delicate touch while you're dealing with the physical realities of development. And David Furneaux, Managing Director of Kodiak Ventures. This is a venture capital firm that looks at transformative companies in the urban and high-tech sectors. And Tom Rand, the Managing Director of Mars Clean Tech Fund. Tom is one of Canada's leading developers of clean and profitable energy industry. Our moderator is Philip Enquist. Over to you, Philip.
Thank you very much. This is an awesome panel. So I hope you start putting your questions down. We're going to break twice. Right in the middle of this session for questions, and then at the end we'll have a second round of questions. So I'd just like to start by welcoming this panel, and maybe we could start by talking about the importance of this vision for innovation cities is also tied to an idea of a vision that speaks to innovative regions. You can't really have an innovative city if you're set within a declining environment or in a region that is suffering from environmental issues. So there's a balance I think we need between an economic vision for jobs, new jobs, the future economic vision of a city, and an environmental vision. So maybe I could, who should I start with? Maybe Tom.
So, well, nothing exists in isolation, and I think as we were speaking a little bit about backstage, I mean, a city only is a city because there's truckloads full of food coming in every day. Those trucks come from somewhere, and it's not just a warehouse. So I would first make the point that, you know, cities are in the front line of climate change, whether we know it or not, because we simply rely on a whole ecosystem out there. But in terms of generating innovation, I also think cities are on the front line in a regional sense, because, look, we're not going to build a clean tech economy in Canada by selling solar panels to China. That's just not what we're going to do. What we are going to do, I hope, is build innovations on the smart grid, which is not just a Toronto hydro distribution grid, but it is a balance between different distribution grids. These are the capillaries of the energy system, and the transmission and generation that sits between them. And if we can intelligently manage the risks, for example, that the Green Energy Act brings with the fluctuations on wind power and solar, so there's some pretty sort of conservative views about how much you can put on the grid. Well, my own view is if you sort of open that up a little bit and intelligently manage the instability that comes, then our ability to innovate across regions and on those grids, they're an asset, and that we'll be able to develop solutions and innovations that we will sell to China, that we will sell to India, because we do have networking expertise, and we do have the ability to. There's some great companies that have energy storage, for example. So viewing the utilities as being interrelated and viewing that grid stability as being a large emergent problem that you can only see across a region is a real opportunity if we allow the instability of the Green Energy Act to sort of percolate a little bit and see them as an opportunity, right? So that involves regulatory cooperation and all that kind of stuff.
Phil, I'd add something to that. I think it's, Tom's, of course, precisely right. It's not just an issue of how we manage our own internal environmental issues within a given city's census metropolitan area. You know, I actually brought a picture I wanted to show you, which I think is really gobsmacking, because we've been talking, I was thinking about this over lunch. I'll tell you what that is in a second. It's actually the same picture. That's Shanghai in 1990 on top, and that's Shanghai in 2010 on the bottom. So when we're thinking about how long it takes to build subways and other infrastructure in places like Toronto or New York, it's important to keep that in mind. But the point I want to make about that isn't so much, isn't that marvelous and isn't it gobsmacking? It's how do you think something like that gets done? Not from a procedural point of view or a governance point of view, but where physically do those resources come from? And as part of a global environmental organization that's largely focused on protecting the big productive systems within the natural world, I think it'd be a failure of our imagination collectively as people who are deeply interested in civic issues and city issues if we failed to understand that the nodes we heard about over lunch, city to city, the networked world, are also connected to real productive ecosystems in the natural world. That we cannot live the way we live unless we can rely on natural productivity. And I know that sounds relatively axiomatic, but the lives we construct for ourselves in cities are largely designed to wall ourselves off from nature. And that's why I think what John's doing at Waterfront is really important, because it's very important that within these urban boundaries, we connect ourselves imaginatively to nature. And the only way to do that is to instill that sense of connectivity in our everyday routines and, more importantly, in our kids and grandkids.
We actually have a very unique opportunity in Waterfront because we, as Gerald says, we have this area that we can actually not just look at redevelopment, but revitalization, which also talks to sustainability and those other features that you're referring to make sure that we're looking at aquatic habitats, green spaces, and so on and so forth.
How big is this area? Can you tell us about the waterfront?
It's by legislation, it's 2,000 acres. Which is probably, it makes it, I think, the largest redevelopment area in North America, one of the largest waterfront revitalizations probably in the world. It's probably $30 to $35 billion of total investment, homes for 115,000 people or so, 10 million square feet of office space. It's probably 30, well, certainly at least 30 plus years of revitalization effort.
And for those of us not from Toronto, how did this project come about?
Look at the time, John.
Yeah,
we only have 43 minutes.
Well, after 200 years of studies, which is true, the first one was done in the 1790s. The three governments got together as part of the Olympic bid to dedicate funds and land to revitalize the waterfront. It's part of the failed Beijing Olympic bid. So, but the concept was we really want to build a great city, a new face to Toronto, which basically helps show the world that we can build great cities.
Thank you. Can we talk a little bit about maybe some global benchmarks? What cities, regions in the world are really making headway that are good models for us to be looking at? Jerry?
Well, I mean, I think necessity is the mother of invention, right? And it's the global cities that have to solve these problems that are largely solving them. China's got a lot of downside environmentally, but it's also creating an urban infrastructure. I mean, there are a lot of people, if you haven't been to China, I think a lot of people think that they're quote unquote catching up to where we are in North America, when the truth is they're completely leapfrogging us. Everyone's excited that you can tweet from the underground now for the London Summer Olympics. Well, I remember being on a trade mission in Beijing in 2004 where I could get BlackBerry messages on the subway. That was the first time I'd ever experienced that. And I think that if you go to any number of Chinese cities that most people in the West have never heard of, you'll see a modern urban infrastructure that Toronto would be envious of. Seoul, though, I'd put at the top of the list.
Yeah, I'd also say we've looked to Northern Europe as well. I mean, Gerald says necessity is the mother of invention. And when they had the oil spike in '71, countries like Sweden didn't have any natural resources, and they've done a fantastic job of really looking at new model infrastructure. I know Lars Henriksen's here from as the trade commissioner, but we've looked to them for examples how to build modern infrastructure that is really, very highly sustainable. And they've done a fantastic job for a country of 9 million people. They're way ahead of us.
I've reviewed Copenhagen's strategy. They've got a program called Zero Carbon Copenhagen that's been going since 1980. And they have reduced carbon emissions by 2/3 from where they were in 1980. Yep. And I think there's some remarkable examples in the world that I think maybe bring me to the next question of just how we generate power. What does energy look like in the future in the Great Lakes region? Does anybody want to grab that one?
Sure, I'd love to. Well, in my view, the way we really need to start thinking about energy, and this again gets back to the notion of regions, right? That if we're really going to decarbon our grid, and I would make the point, and I think I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, it's not optional that we decarbon our grid. It's getting hot. And if those trucks of food are going to keep arriving, we better calm it down. And so the way to think about energy in terms of an energy internet, we hear about that a lot, is really in two ways. One is you have localized intelligence. So now we have storage, here in downtown Toronto. We have intelligent energy management in terms of demand response and all that kind of stuff. So there's a layer of intelligence on the grid. But if you really want to make wind work, critics of wind look at a windmill when it's not turning and say, I don't trust that thing, and they have a point. Wind only works when it's part of an integrated system and you have it spread across different weather patterns and so on. So if you think about our region and our contribution, it's to be thought of in a context of a North American-wide energy grid where you've got lots of solar thermal from the American Southwest, you've got all kinds of biomass from the Canadian prairies, you've got hydro from Newfoundland and Quebec and so on. And it's that continent-wide dance of energy where one type of energy and one geography plays off against another, right? When the tides recede on the east coast, the wind picks up in the west and so on. And if you think about that energy dance, then you can really think about a zero to or low, very low carbon grid. If you're not going to think about energy in that way, then putting up solar panels and windmills is nice, and I think we should be doing it, but let's not pretend it's going to solve the problem. It only solves the problem if we think about it on that scale, and that's really where we think about innovation in cities, feeding this energy internet. You think about the strengths your region has in terms of energy production, and it feeds into this North American-wide grid. So I think we need to think about how we play. And what we have is an asset in Niagara Falls. It's one of the most powerful assets you can have, which is hydro as peak control, right? So you can put all kinds of wind and stuff on this grid, and you just have Niagara Falls matching it, following it.
But you also have to balance that, Tom, with demand reduction. You have to really look at conservation efforts and so forth. We've mandated the buildings in the waterfront to be 50% reduction in energy. We're looking at, how do you design a neighborhood to be carbon neutral? Like we're tied up with the Clinton Climate Change Initiative people and had to develop with the help of the OPA, a carbon modeling tool to help make decisions based on reducing carbon, for example.
I'll up you one. I've got a building down the road that I developed called Planet Traveler, which is a 75% reduction in carbon. And back to your earlier point, and I'll let Dave speak to this as well. Look, one of the things that is really politically unpalatable is running for office saying I'm going to make energy prices higher. But unless we do that, we will not unlock the efficiencies in our system. I achieved what I did in my hotel because I'm a motivated developer. I'm richer for it. It's cash flow positive. I can make the economic argument every building in the city could be a 75% reduction. But you have to be motivated to place your capital there, and I'm mildly richer. Whereas if we paid what they pay in Northern Europe for energy, which is 3 times what we pay, boy, you'd see a lot of people motivated. Sure. It's not just early adopters and carbon geeks who'll do this, but it'll be everybody. And so I think the hardest question we need to ask, hardest question we need to answer, is how is it that we increase the price of energy? Because without that, we're not going to have significant reductions in the energy use. And if we don't have significant reductions in energy use, we're not going to build enough renewable power to replace our coal and natural gas. So I think that's a really tough question. In the States, that's anathema, right? Higher energy prices is not a patriotic thing to say.
That's right. That's right. The area that I've been focused on is food, and looking at within urban centers, the crazy problem we have, which is we're importing food to these food deserts, and we're doing it, and it's just crazy because you're getting food from all over the world, blueberries in February coming from Chile and so on and so forth, high prices, clogged roads, using a ton of energy. So I think what I've been focusing on for about 5 years is how do we invert the food production model and the food distribution model so that we can grow the food where people live and do so in a way that cuts down dramatically on the energy used to grow the food and increases the yield of the food and, of course, delivers a cleaner product, a safer product at a lower price. And so as an entrepreneur, I've attacked this. We went to Holland and we looked at it's the breadbasket of Germany, and it's under glass. If you fly into Amsterdam, you notice there's a lot of greenhouses. And if you look behind the covers of these greenhouses, over the years, they've become technology platforms. Right. And they've started to really understand how to maximize yield of crops and grow clean crops, whether it's organic or close to organic fruits, vegetables, herbs, things like that. And so we looked at it and said, let's take the expertise that's been developed here in Holland, let's apply it to dense cities, and let's go and build controlled agriculture platforms. Think of them as clean technology platforms on the tops of buildings, because the top of a building isn't being used. And build commercial scale food production facilities that can then produce the food, harvest it in the morning, and distribute it to the consumer in the neighborhood that day. And by doing so, you use 90% less water, and you produce a product that you can price below what's on the shelf today, and it's a long-term solution. So the first place we did this was in Montreal, and we built this company there. It's about 1.5 years old in production. But what I've learned through the process is to go, we took a problem, we said, let's go show that we can tackle the problem, and then we can scale the solution beyond one city to many cities. And so we're now expanding the company beyond Montreal to other cities over time. But we had to do so in partnership with government. It couldn't be done by a collection, a band of entrepreneurs, because you need to fit within a municipality or a region, and there's implications. But what we found is very surprising was doors opening everywhere. So there's 12 cities in North America that have passed tax incentives and changed the zoning laws for our company because we're the first one in the world to do it. And they're saying, come on in. And then islands like Iceland, Puerto Rico, Singapore, they're saying, come on in, we'll go raise taxes from the consumer, and you can go lay down this platform and we can stop importing all our food. So the implications are dramatic.
How much food can you grow?
We grow tons of food. It's amazing. We're feeding in a 1 acre footprint. We feed around 3,000 people annually.
What?
And it's
just their broccoli, right? I mean, all their food?
We're growing 60 varieties of fruits, vegetables, and herbs and microgreens in a 1 acre facility that feeds 3,000 people a week.
Is this on a rooftop?
On a rooftop, yeah.
Would this apply to countries with extreme weather, like Middle Eastern countries that really aren't growing any of their own food today?
Yeah, the technology platform can be applied to a warm climate or a cold one. 2 weeks ago, I was in Iceland, population of 300,000 people. They import all their food. The prices that they pay for their food is unsustainable. And so it's a real solution for a place like Iceland, but it's also a solution for a warmer climate like Puerto Rico.
There's this great quote by Rick Bayless, who's a Chicago chef, where he said, cities of tomorrow will be farms we happen to live in. And he grows quite a bit of his own food on his rooftops and his backyards, and his production, I guess, is quite phenomenal as well if you know what you're doing. And do you see cities becoming farms of a new
We're
kind?
already seeing it. It's amazing. And I look across, just taking North America, the innovation that's happening is absurd. And it's happening at the entrepreneur to entrepreneur level. The restaurateur is growing microgreens. They're putting tomatoes on their roof. So this is happening. But then if you then layer in large scale, I'm talking large scale commercial operations, you can really invert the food production and distribution model. And the implications are astounding. It's a closed loop water filtration system so that you're saving 90% of the water to grow the same amount of food and 50% less energy. So I guess the point I'm making, and we'll go up to another level, is entrepreneurs have to aggressively pinpoint problems, know they're going to run up against challenges, because you always do, and then partner with forward-thinking governments whether it's the local or the federal, or the provincial or the regional, the state in the United States. And I think they're there. I think everyone's ready to do it. It's going to come down to execution from talented entrepreneurs with good funding behind them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I don't want to minimize its impact, but I want to restate something I said at the outset, which is that the problems that we deal with every day in a city, the availability of food, the variety of food, seasonally, where can we grow our food, that sort of thing, really aren't the problem. You know, we can have all the micro farms we want. It's not going to change the fact that the Mekong Delta is the rice bowl of Asia. It's not going to change the fact that we need vast tracts of land to grow soy and a lot more productivity out of the ocean to supply seafood. You know, and I guess what I'm driving at is I think that it's easy for us not easy, it's seductive for us in big, modern, in particular Western cities, to pretend that when we solve our own problems, that we're solving the bigger problems. And we are intimately connected to the systems that are creating those problems in the first place. We talk a lot about energy in the context of climate change, and that's absolutely appropriate. But if you put land use change and emissions from agriculture together, it's the biggest source of GHG emissions in the world. And that's not going to change unless we can figure out, and this is where I would like to see entrepreneurial energy and expertise and innovation applied, is in decarbonizing those supply chains. You know, because there it's a double whammy. I was in Borneo a couple of years ago, and that is one of the most spectacular, aesthetically spectacular places in the world. It's also one of the most biologically productive, super biodiverse place. And we are mowing it down to supply cosmetics and processed food to Asia. That's what we're doing, to grow palm oil. And to me, you know, you look at those things and you have to ask yourself, why is all this happening? And it's not because there are evil people at Nestle who think that they're going to squeeze every ounce of productivity out of the world for their own gain. It's because we largely are disconnected from the consequences of the choices we make. That I would bet there are a lot of people in this room who didn't know who don't know what palm oil is, where it comes from, and how it's integrated into our retail cosmetics and food industry. And the good news is, because I do think it's an optimistic point, is we now have, from a communications perspective and a technological perspective, we're the first generation in the history of the world that can really understand these things and change them. You know, I tell this story often. Tom's probably heard me say it before, but I was in the first class at McGill, and I'm not that old. My kids think I'm a lot older. But I was in the first class at McGill where everybody was given an email address. That wasn't that long ago.
The World Wide Web's still here, is it?
Yeah, exactly. And my 6-year-old, I think literally his 8th word was BlackBerry. Largely because it's what he saw Dad, quote unquote, playing with all the time. But that's an enormous change in the world. And I think we're just beginning to understand how we can harness that.
But I think we can also, I mean, I'm a clean tech guy, and my job is to get innovation into the market. So I don't want to downplay the importance of innovation or how clever we monkeys are with our opposable thumbs and big brains and vocal cords. We're enormously clever. But we have an enormous amount of hubris as well, right? That every time we push the order button, in comes the pizza and so on. And we've disassociated ourselves from the idea that, you know, from Sir Francis Bacon onwards, we saw that nature is a thing that we can control and it serves our needs. And I'll give you one example of these constraints, these core constraints meeting each other, right? That the Club of Rome was right, you know. One of the things we need to do is replace liquid fuels. You know, when you talk about electrification of transport, well, if every car that is gasoline was made electric, you'd have to double electrical production, roughly, in North America. That's not the trucks. That's just the gasoline-powered cars. So that's not an answer, you know. That just makes it all the harder to decarbon the grid. So you looked at liquid fuels. Well, there's you can't use corn or palm oil there's just not enough. You'd had every single soybean in the United States made into biodiesel. You'd replace 5% of American diesel use. So that's not an option. So you look to the next step. You say, well, let's not compete with food. Let's have cellulosic-based fuels, which I think is the most promising one. There's a report out by the US Department of Energy that has places out. It's called the billion-ton report. There's an absolute limit, theoretical limit on the sustainable amount of biomass being produced on the continent. You could maybe produce about 1/3 of the oil, you know. So you add Canada to it, maybe there's a theoretical limit of 1/2, but you're never going to get past 1/4 in practical terms. So now you've got these these competing interests. You know, that's why I'm curious at how much food we can produce in cities. 3,000 people per acre sounds like a lot. I'd like to question you on that. Obviously, there's 3,000 people of some kind of food coming from an acre, but not all their food. I can't imagine that's true. So we need land, we need wheat, we need rice and so on, and we also need fuel, we need liquid fuels. The hardest one to replace is going to be oil, right? The electricity, we know how to do it. I described the grid to you. That technology is around today. Just start deploying it. What we need is financial innovation and political innovation and, you know, next generation to make it more efficient, all that kind of stuff. But on liquid fuel, we have some fundamental constraints, right? That we just don't have enough biomass being made on an annual basis on the planet to sort of replace fuels. You can go to the oceans, there's some possibilities there and so on. These are fundamental constraints, right? And I think we need to recognize those constraints and stop seeing ourselves looking at technology as being a way out of all of these problems. Right. We have to talk about behavioral change. Yep. We have to talk about lowering our hubris a little bit and starting to think about how we dance with nature and not command it to our purposes. And that requires a different view of who we are, which has been deeply embedded in the wonderful technological society that we've built from Sir Francis Bacon onward. And this is a deep premise. The future always gets better. Technology solves all problems. Human imagination is unlimited. And yes, sixth word is BlackBerry, and we're very clever people, but we're probably not clever enough unless we begin to think in different ways about who we are and how we interact. And I think that's the fundamental challenge that we face.
But is one of the answers of that, though, to design our cities differently?
Absolutely,
I mean,
for sure.
80% of our population lives in urban areas.
Yep.
They're presenting, what, 40% of the greenhouse gases. So part of the solutions are in building innovative cities that don't require as much liquid fuel or other kinds of resources like that.
No question. I would agree with that statement 100%.
Yeah, sure. I would agree with that, Tom, actually. I don't think it's, I have no great sort of hubristic faith in technology. And I think that the trend is even deeper than that. It goes beyond Francis Bacon. It's in Genesis 1, right? In a large part of our culture. But the issue for me is, how do you connect people? Because after all, the hubris that you just described is culturally circumscribed. And it's historically circumscribed. This has not existed for all people everywhere at every time. In fact, when you look at the percentage of the world's population that not only believes, whether subconsciously or overtly, in that worldview, it's a really small number of people. You know, I had this conversation with my kid the other day, my son the other day, where he asked me if Toronto was the biggest city in the world, right? But this is an interesting, you know, this is a really interesting viewpoint. We're coming back from Toronto Island, and he's looking at the skyline, and he says, is this the biggest city in the world? And I said, well, it's one of the bigger cities in North America, but by far the most people on Earth live in Asia. And most of those people in Asia or Africa or Latin America do not have that same sort of hubris. And part of what I'm saying is that in order for us to get over that, we need to somehow connect with the way people actually live elsewhere and not be so arrogant to assume that the way we live is a God-given right. It's only ever going to get better. And understand that there's a bigger picture out there. I don't think communications technology is going to solve our problems. I think it's going to give us the platform to solve our problems, which is, I think, a very different thing.
A little earlier today, there was a lot of talk about big data and the ability to access it and now manage it. Do you think that enables us to use this data at the scale of the planet, that we're starting to see ways to manage direct resources, use of resources at a planet scale? Is that coming? You know, do our political boundaries get in the way of really efficient thinking?
Anybody else want to go?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, answer is absolutely yes.
One other thing on where you were going, I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I've done a lot of business over the years up in Canada, and I've done a lot of business elsewhere, Asia. United States, of course. I think shaking at least the United States hubris is kind of hard.
Yeah.
You know, it's a pretty hubristic environment. Is that a word?
Yeah.
But I think that by defining things, actionable things that can be done that will benefit the people that are living their lives there. Like, for example, there's no reason why the food that are on our shelves, the packaged food, can't be in compostable packages. The technology's there.
Sure.
Everything that we buy off the shelf can be thrown away and degraded. There should be incentives to do that. Or I was in New York City a couple days ago with the Durst family. They're a large real estate family in Manhattan, and they're a part of building the new World Trade Center tower. And they took me through the innovations going on there, and they decided that they wanted to build that new building, which is quite a sight, by the way, and it's going up pretty fast, to be thoughtful and green in the way they do it. So they have solar windows, taking in the solar energy and inverting it to the grid. They've got ice being made in the basement at night and being used to cool the building during the day. They've got a composter for everyone in the building, which is, you can imagine, a lot of people. They're changing the behavior of the people in the building to compost. In their board, after their board meeting, there's a place to put the trash, and then there's a place to put the food trash, and it goes down a chute into the basement. I mean, it's amazing. So anyway, it's little things that we need to find that are actionable that we can kind of create incentives around for people to go and do, and that's what's going to make the difference, I think.
Yeah, I think waiting for a planetary solution is not going to happen.
No.
Who's going to implement it? I mean, I think you need to look at things at a city level, and how do you build up and do all these things and make changes and maybe change attitudes at the same time, and that really will get you there. Yes, slower, but probably it will get you there in the long run.
So let's come back to that, maybe where leadership is coming from. But we're kind of at the halfway point. I want to open it up for questions, and then we'll come back to this discussion. So please give us some of your toughest questions. Yes?
It was mentioned about incentives. What about disincentives? And I guess the closest was Tom, who said that energy must be more expensive. And typically the way Europe has chosen is really to increase the price of energy and also strategic fees. And probably the wallet is the most efficient way of changing behavior. What is the likelihood of disincentives in North America?
If we're not going to price carbon, we're not going to solve this problem. I think we're beginning to realize we need to solve this problem in North America. I think our eyes are opening, and they're opening south of the border. People, I think the everyday person understands something needs to be done. So I think the political atmosphere is changing, so the price of carbon is fundamental. But I make sort of another point to that too. I mean, we talk about sort of behavioral change in information and so on. If a CFO of a big company looks at the line item and it says energy costs, if they just decide that that line item is core to my business, right, and I want to hedge my risk on upside and all the rest of that kind of stuff, so even before we get a pricing signal for that externality, if the psychology of the CFO changes, that's core to my business, so I don't have to reduce it with operational costs, I can reduce it with capital costs, and I can take a 5-year payback, not a 9-month payback. Suddenly I can do more than change my light bulbs. And so I think there are smaller moves that can be made where you can see potential downside from increased energy, and before that signal comes, you can act. And that's just a new way of thinking on behalf of the CFO. And that's data, a very simple piece of data, and it's a behavioral change, very simple behavioral change. But long term, we're not going to price carbon. We're not going to solve this problem.
Yep.
Well, the other challenge we've got as well in Canada is, I mean, our energy is too cheap. But if we went to world pricing and the U.S. didn't, all our businesses will go bankrupt. So we're, in a sense, tied to the hip with the U.S. economy, and unless our energy prices match, we're not going to be able to survive. That's a real challenge.
To some extent, though. I mean, I make the point about my building. I'm wealthier as a hotelier for having made this decision to reduce my energy by 75%. There is low-hanging fruit we can do today without worrying about competing with the States for a steel industry. We could have met Kyoto. We could have blown past Kyoto just retrofitting our buildings.
That's right.
Canadian solar thermal, Canadian trades, Canadian electricians, Canadian pipes, Canadian heat pumps, Canadian drain water heat recapture, Canadian LED lights. It's all Canadian economic activity. And I think that's really low-hanging fruit. So I think we can put some incentives in place. We can show some moral leadership at the federal level and say this is important. When they killed the eco-energy grants, they didn't just take away a few $100 from a homeowner wanting to do an energy retrofit. They basically said, we don't see it as important. Part of the purpose of government is to set a moral tone and decide what's strategically important. The reason Japan and Germany have economies that are twice as efficient as ours, twice the GDP per unit of energy, is because they had an effective carbon tax since the Second World War. Strategic decision, right? So I think there is low-hanging fruit we can get to long before we price carbon, but we need to have an adult conversation about why we should be doing it. Because I can make more money, perfectly frankly, investing in a t-shirt factory than I can do renovating my hotel. I can make money renovating my hotel, but I can make more doing other things, and we need to flip that around. So the low-hanging fruit needs to be emphasized, and I think that's the role of government.
Well, you're right, because I think some of that low-hanging fruit you can't grasp until you change some of the structure. You're talking about a hotel, that's okay because you're paying the gross operating costs, but in a commercial building, the tenants are paying the operating costs. They're flow-throughs. Real estate developers, whether they're residential or commercial, are really just financial intermediaries. And so you'd have to really revert leases to semi-gross leases where actually some of the common energy costs were paid for by the landlord. Then you'd see real change. But right now it's a flow-through. It's hard to convince people to invest money that save their tenants money. It doesn't, they don't get any payback. So they're more competitive, but dollar for dollar, it's not a great incentive. So you have to change some of the. And if you changed it universally, through regulations, you could do that. But you can't ask one person to take it on and make themselves put themselves in a non-competitive position.
That's what governments are here for: show some leadership and set the rules of the game. The private sector will play by those rules and solve an enormous number of problems. But if the rules aren't set in the entrepreneur's favor, you're swimming upstream, and there's no point doing it.
I agree with that. I think that the biggest gains would be in retrofitting existing buildings to become much more energy efficient. Not just emphasizing new buildings meeting high LEED standards. And cities can offer tax incentives, financial incentives for working together to reduce energy needs and becoming much more efficient. I think the retrofit is low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. Any other questions we've got out there? Yes?
I've got another question. I love the sort of diversity of sort of different systems and challenges that you guys have each brought up. Coming from an urban research institute, I'm really interested in how cities are really systems of systems, and there's been a lot of discussion of chaotic complexity and whatnot. And one of the interesting questions that I'm looking maybe for some examples or some ideas is how do we take some of that knowledge of complexity and translate that to decision making? And so there's been some discussions of structural changes, of changing the way that we communicate behavioral changes. So I'm interested into maybe some specific examples in maybe each of your fields of how we can apply this understanding of complex systems, this interconnection to decision making, and what are really some of the challenges or obstacles in decision making that future research can apply itself to?
I wouldn't mind tackling that to start off with. And I have to give you a bit of a long-winded answer, I'm afraid. Part of the challenge we have, attended the conference yesterday, and there's all these ideas bubbling out about how to innovate, how to do things better, and that's great, and the private sector can do that very well. The challenge is, for most of the stuff that's infrastructure, it's the government that basically regulates and has to accept those changes. But governments, by their very structure, are very risk-averse. I mean, you have politicians, I know there's some in the room here, and they have all my sympathy because they can make 1,000 good decisions and one bad decision, and that's the decision that ends up in the paper the next morning. And that culture spreads down through the organizations. We have a very risk-averse culture, one that regulates, which again sort of sets minimum standards. And currently, those employees in the organization who are very talented, but under the gun insofar as workload and all other kinds of things, you're asking them now to take risks, innovate, and that's a real challenge. So there's a real dichotomy. You have this academia and private sector wants to innovate, and you've got government that's basically risk averse. And so I think part of the solutions is to convince government to basically, and someone used the word in a previous presentation, to arbitrage that risk. How do we get government to basically get services done by the private sector and not have to do it themselves? So really it's to try to have government set policy and have things done by the private sector where innovation can thrive. But it's very hard to make it thrive inside government. I mean, there's great people in there trying, but boy, it's a real struggle.
So just a quick point. I like the systems of systems idea and complexity, right? So if we stop thinking about the economy like Adam Smith thought about it, as a physical thing that settles into equilibrium, right? It's a very old and simple math that doesn't apply. Think about it from dynamic systems theory point of view, a language which you probably understand. Then you come to the realization that, well, first of all, we need to understand that we can't decide, say I'm the government, I can't decide what the solution is going to be because the world is too complex to predict. But what I can do is I can set the rules of the game to allow the system to evolve in a particular direction without defining the target, right? So the left, the typical left, has to acknowledge the limits of our ability to decide where we're headed, but the right's got to acknowledge that we can set the rules of the game such that that system can evolve towards a particular destination. And so you can't sort of describe a solution, but you can set a direction. And in a market economy, the simplest way to do that is set a price on something. Set a price on an externality, and you'll see every single transaction throughout the economy begin to change overnight because certain things cost more and certain things cost less. Certain behavior costs more, certain behavior costs less. So if we acknowledge that, put a price on carbon, for example, and you'll see the entire economy start to shift and move in another direction. You don't have to decide what technologies will win. You don't have to decide what companies are going to win. All that will evolve. It's a dynamic system. It'll find its new place. But you can set the rules of the game. And so that's the first thing I think we need to acknowledge, that the system is so complex that we cannot predict in detail where it's headed or what the winning technologies are. But we can set its direction. That's what the rules of the game are for.
I'd chime in on that as well. I think that's an excellent question, by the way. And you know, I look where we've had a lot of experience in complex systems at WWF. We work with very large companies who are at very consequential leverage points within commodity production supply chains, right? So to make that a little more concrete, and we take a lot of flack from others in the environmental movement for working with companies, but I think we understand deeply that these gentlemen are right. That's where innovation comes from, largely. And while price is a really important motivator, it's not the only signal for companies, especially big companies. So for instance, we take a lot of flack for working with Coke. We work with Coke all over the world, and we chose Coke very strategically because they purchase, believe it or not, 2% of the world's sugar. And they're the second largest purchaser of citrus in the world. And they're the largest purchaser of aluminum in the world. So we could spend 50 years lobbying 70 governments for regulatory reform to change these production systems. Or we could convince Coke on the basis of social license to operate and market access, and more importantly for them, long-term access to a commodity. That they have to demand that the way their stuff is grown or produced is different from the way it's been done in the past and more sustainable. And if they decide, as they have, that they're only going to purchase sugar that's grown in a certain way, it changes the whole supply chain overnight. And I think that's a really important insight, because most of the campaigns you see are directed at consumers. And what we've, I think, figured out is that if you focus it on the really important leverage points in the supply chain, you can make really big change happen quickly. And the best example is Marine Stewardship Council certification for seafood. We created it with Unilever 15 years ago. It didn't exist 15 years ago. Now it's almost 10% of the global seafood market. But that gets, sorry to be a bit long-winded on this, but that gets back to the original point, that for most of us, choosing fish that has an MSC logo on it is about enjoying a conscientious $30 lunch in downtown Toronto, right? I mean, let's be honest, so that we can feel good about the purchases we make. The truth is, there are 1.5 billion people on this planet whose only source of protein is the ocean. And if we gather up all that protein for us and fail to reform our means of producing that protein, then they're going to have a much bigger problem than we're going to have in downtown Toronto. And that's kind of our perspective on it.
The only other thing I'd add to this, because it's an interesting conversation, is I think we overlook the importance of people. It always comes down to a couple people in Coke, yep, and the mayor of Boston, or a couple people in Toronto, absolutely, that are going to make the decision. And they're going to make the decision if they have the information. So I think what's really important, big data, is to bring together the information. We've got it at our fingertips. It's all there. We have to be able to package it up and be able to make it a safe bet for the people that are in positions of power. So I see it in Boston. Mayor Menino, he's been in that position for quite a while. He finally decided to partner with Massport and take the seaport area and call it an innovation district. And then they defined some rules around it, and they said innovation means these 10 things, go to town. Tax incentives, tax breaks, zoning, the whole thing. And that's what has to happen. But why was he convicted to do it? Because he had the information to feel safe to do it. So that information has to exist, but it really comes down to people. People have to have some guts, and that's it, in my view.
You're here.
So we were talking about leadership before, and I just would like to throw out one more question before we open it back up. I mean, where is leadership coming from? If it's individual people, is this only a bottom-up strategy? Is there a top-down strategy that parallels this? Can nations be leaders in innovative regions? Are we seeing that? It seems like it has to be both somehow, doesn't it? David?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, you got to take it from both sides, right? But not all governments have good leadership, because leadership is, it's not management, it's leadership. And very few, I think, have good leadership. But the ones that do, you know which ones they are, because they make things happen. Yeah. The groundswell that comes from people and from public opinion, I think that's always going to be there, because we all have an interest in our voices being heard. The internet just amplifies it. So that'll continue. But we've got to hone in on, and that's what I try to do, when I'm evaluating where am I going to go next with a certain business, I'm as much evaluating the landscape that I'm going into from a leadership point of view. And that's what we have to do when we look at commercializing and scaling innovative ideas. We've got to partner up with the people that are good leaders.
I think leaders also can be freer to lead if they recognize that the masses are there behind that principle. I mean, one of the things I found very interesting, we set LEED Gold as a criteria for developing the waterfront. But what really happened was that the commercial landlords heard from the big tenants who were trying to hire young people, who said, if I have to hire those young people, I've got to represent the green agenda, their agenda. Therefore, Mr. Landlord, you better build me a LEED Gold building. So it really was a ground-up effect as well. I think as that sort of agenda becomes more commonplace among people, I think then leaders will be freer to lead in that agenda, I say.
Yeah, and I think that's a real source for optimism. I mean, in the end, we are in really early days in this debate. And forgive the boomers in the room will forgive me for this, but
forgive you already.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. You know, this climate change has only been a universally recognized issue, whatever you think of it, for a decade or so. It was a niche issue in the 90s. Al Gore made it really famous. And I think one of the, he did many positive things about it, but one of the disservices was creating this apocalyptic sense about it. You know, I don't think that the baby boomers are the first generation in the history of the world to confuse their own demise with the planet's, but they have raised it to an art form, and I really think that we're going to solve this problem largely because we have to. And the issue for us isn't whether there are going to be people walking around the face of the earth 500 years from now. It's going to be, what are they going to think of us, right? As the first people who had all the information, to get back to data, that we need to solve this problem. And to date, our response has basically been, it's not convenient for us to do it, and it's a little too expensive. I think that's that's a pretty sad explanation to hang our hats on.
We're down to 3 minutes left. You have a choice. Do you want more questions, or should we let each panelist have a closing statement?
Questions.
One quick question. The biggest threat we've got to the Great Lakes, in my mind, is the free trade. We now, like with the CETA program coming in from Europe, we're going to be having foreign vessels here, water leaving the country. We've got Asian carp coming in. We've got different areas being controlled, whether it be a province or state or a country. How are we going to now get this all together so we get someone taking care of the Great Lakes before in 10 years it's all wrecked?
Well, I think that's a very important point. Who owns it and who manages it, and the opening up this very pristine watershed to other watersheds has, as we've all seen, created phenomenal damage. The invasive species damage is just unbelievable, not just within the Great Lakes watershed, but also what's moved through the Great Lakes watershed into the rest of the continental United States in that direction, now the Asian carp going the other way. I think that's a very important question. Who manages, who steps up to this scale of problem? Jerry's got to answer that.
I have no answer to that question. I think it's really vexatious. I think it's a really difficult. If we've learned anything from the last 10 years of climate negotiations, it's that there's little to no confidence in global governance mechanisms, either at the national level amongst political actors, or even more so, I think, in civil society and various, and I think you're speaking from that perspective, sir. I don't think that we did the hard work of building trust in the people charged with making those decisions. And when it came time to make the decision, the big decision at Copenhagen, they all shied away from it because they knew they didn't have support back home. And I think that's a real problem.
But these two countries have been longtime friends. I mean, if leadership at an international level can happen at all, it should happen between Canada and the United States. This is where it should start, in my mind.
I'm with you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
We've heard recently that the federal government seems to be wanting to reduce the amount of new research and amount of data that's going into the market. Are you seeing that? Is that, or are there just other sources that are doing it? It doesn't need to be done? What are you seeing on that?
It's not happening. I mean, it's, in a way, I run a science-based organization, so it's great for us to have unemployed scientists out there, I guess. But in the end, the places that we really need to monitor are incredibly expensive to maintain, whether that's in the Arctic or the Experimental Lakes Program or, you name it. Canada is a big place that's difficult to monitor. And very expensive to do so, in particular in the Arctic, which we ought to be spending more, not less money researching the impact of climate change. And I think this is one of the biggest issues we're facing as a country, that we just are not collecting, we're not doing the science we need to do to responsibly manage this territory. And we are the luckiest people on the face of the earth to have it in the first place. We're just not willing to invest in it at this stage.
We are out of time. I think the clock's now ticking the other way. So thank you all. Again, just personally, I think this is an awesome panel. Thank you for giving us great questions, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you.